Welcome, everyone, to Beyond Surviving, the safe space for survivors of childhood sexual abuse to receive support, resources, and share their stories. Beyond Surviving is about freedom, healing, connection, and even laughter and fun. Most importantly, it's about letting go of the pain of abuse and finally moving on. I'm Rachel Grant, and I've been a sexual abuse recovery coach since 2007, and I'm the author of Beyond Surviving, the final stage of recovery from sexual abuse. You can learn more about me and the Beyond Surviving program at rachelgrantcoaching.com. Well, folks, I'm so glad to have here with me today my guests, Mudita Nisker and Dan Clurman, who are going to be sharing with us practical skills to help you communicate like a badass. Now, Mudita is a licensed marriage family therapist, coach, and trainer. She works with couples and individuals in her private practice in Oakland, California. She is a strong advocate of lifelong learning. She's led women's communication training groups for over 35 years, y'all. I mean, we have a pro in the house. Having experienced her in real time myself in workshop settings, Mudita brings a powerful, grounded, playful energy to exploring what's not working in your communication and relationships. Now, her partner in crime, Dan Clurman, is also a coach, trainer, and a professor. And over the past 30 years, he's provided communication training and coaching to individuals and organizations in the private, public, government, and nonprofit sectors. He has seen something, been some places. He is also on the faculty of the psychology department at the Golden Gate University in San Francisco. And it just happens that he was one of my professors. And in fact, I really attribute and credit him for helping me see coaching as a viable path for the work that I wanted to do. I was so glad to learn from him and Mudita, and I am so stoked to have him here and her here with me today. Mudita, Dan, thank you so much for being here. It's such a treat to have you with me today.
Nice to see you, Rachel. Thanks for
It's
having
been
us on
a minute, right?
thanks for having us here. Yes.
Goodness. Yeah, I think I was trying to think like what year I came over to Oakland and did, gosh, but that must have been, I don't know, 2009, 2010, somewhere in that range, and had the joy of being there in your workshop. And of course, Dan, you're one of my mentors and teachers and educators. And I really have been chomping at the bit to have you all here and come to speak to the Beyond Surviving community, because I just know there's such a wealth of knowledge that you have about communication and relationships. So as we jump in today, I want to start with kind of a broad question, which is, why do you think people think that they should just know how to communicate as opposed to it being something that we have to actually develop as a skill set? What's your take on that?
Maybe it's similar to breathing. We don't think we have to know how to breathe. We just breathe. And I think communication is the same way. Everybody's doing it all the time. You can't not communicate. Even when you're not communicating, you're communicating. So it's just so much a part of the fabric of life that it doesn't seem like something that should take special attention. It's just there.
I love that, Mudita. Yeah. So then when we start to have challenges, like if we can't breathe, then all of a sudden we notice, ooh, like I might need to pay attention to this and get some help there. Same with communication. Most of the time, it's when people are really hitting a lot of challenges and having struggle in this area of their lives that they start to say, hey, maybe I need to take a look at this. I'm curious why communication became your favorite thing. Is there anything in particular that led you to focusing on this? Why it's your passion?
Well, maybe I'll go first. I kind of lucked my way into it, I would say. When I was in college, I was studying counseling psychology, marriage and family psychology in itself. I was very interested in relationships. And eventually that led me to a place where I tuned in more to the communication aspect, since that's one of the core parts of relationships. So I kind of fell into it. I hadn't targeted communication as the thing I was going to do in my life, but it just evolved. I just kind of followed the stream of where my life seemed to be going. And I ended up sitting here with you, Rachel.
Right on. I can relate to that, how life just kind of takes you and then all of a sudden, bam, here you are. This is
That's
what you're
right.
doing.
That's right.
And
I feel that.
I came towards it more from anthropology. I initially had thought I was actually going to be an anthropologist, and was very interested in cross-cultural communication and language in particular. So I was interested in that, and then on a practical level, had opportunities to get involved with studying communication. And it also seemed to help a lot in terms of relationships where I didn't have such great conditioning around communication growing up. So it helped me to really see the benefits of communicating better with people. And that started to reinforce studying it more.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that about, yeah, kind of your origins there, Dan. That's really cool. Or for that matter, for you, Mudita. So you come into this world of saying we're going to find out how to improve interpersonal and interpersonal communication. And I think that's just right there, such a fascinating thought to me, that we often think of as communication as just something that's always happening between ourselves and something external and someone else. But you all also teach about intrapersonal communication, which we might also, I think, label as self-talk. Let's dig into that a little bit. Do you think there's one before the other? Do we have to develop really strong intrapersonal skills and understand how we're speaking to ourselves and how we're communicating with the self as a foundation to interpersonal, or can they happen side by side? Is there any order of operations here?
I think that different people have different perspectives on it for sure.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
I guess part of my view, and I think maybe Mudita's, is that we are swimming in a social world that teaches us a lot about how to use language and how to communicate with each other. People are constantly modeling different ways to communicate. And that's where the cultural side comes in. In different cultures, there are very different ways to communicate. It's quite varied. So that reinforces the way in which we communicate with ourselves. If you're communicating in a different language, that's going to provide a whole different way of perceiving the world, because there are certain words that are in other languages that aren't in our own. So I think it's really a mutually reinforced situation. The society we live in shapes the way we talk to ourselves, and the way we talk to ourselves shapes the way we will communicate with others. And we just go back and forth. It's sort of a one system, really.
It's like
Gotcha.
Chicken and the egg.
Alpha omega problem. Exactly. Where do we start on the circle? Yeah, it's all connected.
Exactly.
Oh, wow. That makes me think an awful lot about how systems of communication and models of communication are so important. And I think what's really true for a lot of my community is that they've grown up in homes where communication skills were limited or not present at all. Or they might sit on the extremes of communication. So, maybe a lot of silencing or minimizing, kind of masking communication, or explosive, volatile communication. And so when you think a little bit about that piece of the puzzle of like direct models, yeah. What do you see as being some of the biggest influences when we grow up in households where, communication is stifled or limited, or abusive?
Right. I'm just going to back up and just to respond to the idea of, like, so many people growing up in households that didn't really model the kind of skillful communication that people would like to have more of.
Yeah.
And that the good news is that communication is a learned skill, after all. And having the belief that you're either born a good communicator or not is a very limiting belief. So once people can acknowledge that it's something they can learn, and that it would, in fact, really be useful to learn some skills in that domain of communication. That is a life changer. If you don't know that you don't know, you can't learn other options. So in terms of people who may have grown up in abusive or, really unskillful homes, communication wise, seeing that there is a way to learn skills can be very liberating, just to even start with that.
Mm-hmm. And then the idea of models of communication, in our map, there's some basic principles about communication, which I think you're familiar with. For example, just the idea of people going on and talking a lot, for example, and not for the other person not having a chance to come in and participate in the conversation. We call that flooding rather than chunking messages.
Too much talking, not enough listening.
So in situations where somebody isn't able to develop their own sense of a voice in a way with, their primary people in their life, their parents or in the family, that's a skill that needs to be learned, how to create more of a dynamic balance in conversation so that there's this reciprocity in the conversation.
Wow, I love that. So I want to lean into that a little bit because flooding is such a fascinating concept and something that was really helpful for me. And I find in my own internal system, I have this place of like, I need to get it all said. Like I have it all mapped out in my head, how this part connects to this part, connects to this part. Now finish, essay done. As I'm going through those stages of communication, when a partner interjects at a moment, it can really derail me. And it's almost like, no, you have to wait until I get all the way to the finish here. And then we can have this dialogue. And I still fall into that pattern, even though I know about the flooding, system and how unhelpful that can be. Can you talk with us a little bit about when we're in, I think I'll add another layer to that, which is I think a lot of times survivors of trauma have gone through a lot of silencing and a lot of space in which their voice wasn't allowed. And when they finally start to get some confidence or start to get into a space where I'm going to speak my truth, I'm going to tell you what I need, there's almost this place of, it's like overextension. Like I have to say it all the time, every last bit of it. And then any interruption is almost interpreted as like a stifling or a silencing. So what are some ways that even if we have like our 15 bullet points, try to get through with a partner, how do we create more of that mutuality as you're talking about the ebb and flow without losing the thread or feeling that sense of shutting down, being silenced? What do you think about that?
Well, I'll take a little bit of it, then I want Dan to respond.
Okay.
Being able to say what you just said, and notice that you have a tendency at times to flood, to say more than the other person can take in. You begin to see how, even though you can't stop it every time, you can start to make a little more room for the other person in how you're thinking about a conversation. It's not a monologue, it's a conversation. If it's a monologue, it's totally appropriate. Just take it and flood as much as you want because you've got, you're in the spotlight. But if it's a conversation, the spotlight goes back and forth between you. So learning not to take it personally when the other person wants to participate, but to see that it's actually a good thing this person wants to participate with you, to reframe it and think about it differently can be very helpful, because it is frustrating sometimes when you feel like you're not going to get to say what you need to say. Recognizing that you don't have to say it all at one time is really helpful.
Thank you, Mudita.
I would exactly so, and I would say, I kind of grew up and a lot of flooding communication was my model, so I picked up on that and did that myself. I think one of the important elements to pick up on what Mudita's saying is that it, going on longer, it's harder for the other person to actually stay involved in the conversation. So if your intention is to be understood and to influence, it's going to be really important to see how you're affecting the other person throughout what you're saying. And if you just keep going on, you might miss vital responses that the other person has that will shape where you're going to go next. And
Wow.
the improvisational dance of the conversation is so rich when you have that back and forth quality, much more than just a monologue, as Mudita was saying.
Like right now, we're the speakers and you're the interviewer, right? But as Dan was talking, you were signaling that you were interested, you were listening, you were nodding your head, you were making little sounds of acknowledgement. You were letting him know that you were participating with him. If you're talking to someone and they're not making any of those signals, and in fact, they're starting to snore,
Oh, wow.
you know you're speaking longer.
You've gone
than
on
you
too
need
long.
to.
Yeah, I just had a really strong image of my partner. Like, that's what he's doing when he's like not even looking at me. Oh my God, what's happening? He's checked out. He has checked out. What a really it's important point there, that if we're wanting to connect and we're wanting to influence, do you think that those are the primary functions of communication, connection, influence? Are there others? The why we communicate, what we're in for, what our intentions are. Can there be more than just connection and influence?
Well, there's giving information. I guess you could say that's influence. I think those are two of the
biggies. There's also, I would add, the other aspect is to inspire, to discover that a conversation, when it's really rich, not every conversation needs to be rich. Some are much more instrumental, just about getting things done. But certain conversations can be so evocative and inspire both people to see life in a new way, or to have an insight that wasn't there before the conversation. So in a way, there's a lot of metaphors you can apply, but in a way, a conversation's like a journey or an adventure too.
Yeah. I love that. And when we can take things in those smaller bite size, rather than, like, I could say the whole monologue, but my partner might only get like 10% of it. Whereas if I take it a little more slowly, maybe that's a little bit of it too, like that pacing thing and that patience thing, right? Then, like, we've got that piece, great. Okay, and now we can add in this piece, great. And we end up with a much more comprehensive understanding when we take that approach of being in this dance. I love that, the exchange. What do we do when somebody is flooding at us? Are there tactics, are there strategies, are there things that we do or say that can interrupt that without shutting them down? Or what do you think about that? What's a good interrupter in those kinds of moments?
We do have a little piece in our book where we give different things people can say, like, let me come in here for a minute and see if I'm understanding what you're saying. Or, oh, I think Marianne over there wants to say something right now. And then shift your gaze to the other person you want to hear from.
Or before you go on, I just want to say something about the first thing you said.
Okay.
Or all right. Let me make sure I'm understanding what you're saying.
Yeah.
And then
you can go
paraphrase.
Either way. You could use what we call reflective listening to check that you actually are understanding, or you can actually get your comment in. And even though, as a former flooder, somewhat, I would say that it might seem a little jarring initially. It did sometimes when people would want to respond or get into the conversation. After a while, I realized it's sort of like a necessity to make sure we're traveling together. If it is a journey, I want to make sure that the other person is part of the journey on the same path with me. And so we're, really adjusting to each other. So it's actually helpful when you interrupt someone to respond, so that they have a sense of how they are affecting you.
Yeah. I think what I noticed with a lot of times for those of us who have experienced sexual trauma, that there's a lot that's happening in communication that, of course, is under the surface. Yeah, we're not saying exactly what we're saying, or our meaning is there are these shades in which maybe we're trying to use our communication, maybe passive aggressively, to try to get some kind of reassurance, to try to get some kind of acknowledgement of like our worth or our value, and kind of trying to draw something out of the other person. When you think about, working with people around communication, how do you deal with subtext, or even trying to understand what the subtext might be of what somebody else is saying or what you're communicating? How do you get at that?
Mm-hmm. I'll take it, or you want to take it?
Go ahead.
Okay. Well, one way is to notice that when people are saying something to you, there are other things that go along with it that aren't necessarily said. It's like it's like if I start describing a situation that is really challenging, and I'm just describing it in terms of what happened, there's probably feelings that are connected with that you could guess that are going on from the description that I have. So we call that, that there are things that people say explicitly, and there are things that are unstated that are implicit, that go with what's stated explicitly. So as a good listener, as a skillful listener, you can infer, you can guess what's not being stated sometimes, but in a tentative or provisional way, because you might not get it right. So when you are stating it back to the person, if you're using reflective listening or if you're responding, you can leave room for them to correct as well.
Yeah.
Like, for example, right now, as we're talking with each other, we all have our implicit messages that we're not saying, but we are kind of saying. Like maybe one of your implicit messages right now is something like you'd like to learn as much as you can from this interview and have it be as lively and helpful to other people as possible. That could be your implicit positive intention. You're not saying it, but you are saying it.
By other
I love
things
that.
that you're saying.
By the other things I'm saying, yes, I get that. Yeah. What do you do when I think that misinterpretation and meaning making is a big part, and that for survivors of abuse, and that very much is born out of their own internal dialogues and our own internal messaging that we're holding of like, I'm not worthy, I'm not valuable, I'm unlovable, and I can't trust anyone, and people are always going to leave me, and this person's out to get me, and everyone has an agenda. There can be a whole big old soup of things, kind of running in there. And so when you're in dialogue and somebody says explicitly something very maybe basic or simple, there's this potential to kind of jump on that and create a lot of meaning around it. You don't love me, kind of that sort of a thing. And I know you teach in the world of, right, moving out of the you and like speaking into the I, and like when you say that, I think this or I feel this. What can people do, particularly who have a lot of that negative messaging, to start to slow down that process and be able to delineate between what is being expressed to them and what the meaning is that they're adding to what's being said that might be amiss? Yeah. What do you think about that?
Well, I think the more you can examine the assumptions that you're making that aren't working for you, of course, the better you're going to feel about things. In our book, we talk about the idea that we can't stop making assumptions. It's what we do as human beings. Some people think making assumptions is bad or wrong. We say no, we are going to make assumptions if we can see what our assumptions are or get in touch with them or understand that they're going on. Then with some practice, we can evaluate them. We can use perhaps even critical thinking skills to evaluate the accuracy of our assumptions. And so that we don't assume just because we think something, it must be true. that's a really can be a debilitating assumption.
Yeah. I think that what a lot of my clients bring to the table in this arena are those arguments or those conversations that go something like, you said this and that means that you don't love me. And the other person started, no, that's not what I mean. That's not, yes, it is. You said that, that's what it is. And you just get very locked in to this, like, and now we're going to find all the reasons why I'm right. And I'm going to find all the reasons why I'm right. Or
Right.
you're wrong, I'm right. When you start to get into that kind of it's almost like a roadblock to communication, right? Or like that kind of shutdown, or maybe it's a power dynamic. Yeah. I don't know, what would you call that? And what do you do? How do you help yourself and a partner, get out of that kind of moment of who's right, who's wrong?
So yeah, so one way to do that initially, and this is just a small change, and I think it's one that's significant, is just to insert in there that it's an assumption I'm making. If you start to
Mm.
say, when you said this, I assumed you were,
Mm.
and just put the I assumed or I believed, or just to show it's not a fact, it's an opinion you're having. And one of the ways people drive each other crazy is they make statements of that are actually opinions as if they were a fact.
Fact.
And then
Yeah.
they get
Yeah.
into arguing about the quote facts that aren't even the facts. They're actually opinions that are in the language of facts. And that's
Yes.
very, that's, as you can see, socially, that's one of the things we're struggling with as a society is treating opinions as if they're facts.
Right, right.
So
Oh
What
my gosh.
what do you think about the person who's listening to the person who's making those opinions sound like facts? The person who's trying to say, no, that's not what I meant. And the other
well, then
person,
that when someone is saying that's not what I meant, then it's important to shift over and find out, well, what is it that they did mean?
Hmm.
Rather than
Yeah.
assuming that you know what they meant 100%, that your interpretation, your assumption about it is completely accurate.
right?
Create a little space in there to find out, okay, then what is it you did mean? My assumption is that's what you meant, but
Yeah.
that could be
Yeah.
inaccurate.
Right. Woo, passing this along to a couple people I know. I
So, I
think that's
mean,
such a tough one because that invitation to reframe, I think is hard for people. Like once they've decided, I heard you say this and that's what that meant, then to be able to hold space and almost like give someone a redo, right? That's not quite what I meant. Here's what I'm trying to say. In my experience, sometimes it gets so locked down, but you said this.
Yeah.
These are the words you said, and trying to create room for, a rewrite, a redo, let's see if you can, here's what my meaning really is. And do you find that that's a defense mechanism in communication when somebody gets really locked in? Is that a particular type of communication? What do you think
Well,
about
I
that?
think the desire to be right is so
Yeah.
powerful, and we all
Yeah.
feel it. I mean, I know that it rarely leads to satisfaction, and yet I feel the desire to be right. I'd much
Hmm.
rather be right than wrong. Uh,
Yeah. Fair.
yeah. So I think in a way, that seems like part of the core of that is the desire to be right. And I think that has something to do with how we think about or what we think about mistakes that we make. That when we think that we're wrong when we make a mistake and the other person is right, then we're going to have more trouble accepting the fact that maybe what we're saying or thinking is not accurate. If we can
Hmm.
see that, if we're now waking up to what is accurate and we can learn from that, well, that's going to go a lot further in terms of our own happiness and development than
Yeah.
in trying to figure out how we can be right and the other person wrong.
Hmm.
But it's
Yeah.
inevitable. It's inevitable. We all struggle with that
We
or
drop
don't,
into that pattern.
but drop
Yeah.
into that. And so I think self-compassion goes a long way also.
Hmm. Yeah. I know that in your book you share lots of different perspectives and strategies and skills for communication. And I wonder if we could lean into maybe some of your, what I would say is like the no matter what skills. Like if you don't have any communication skills at all, but what you absolutely must have would be like, where would you go with that?
Okay, well, there's several key skills. A really basic one, which is often overlooked, and it's fine to overlook it in conversations where there's not a lot at stake and you're just having fun, but where there's more of a consequential quality or a significance to the conversation, like some of the ones we've been talking about.
Mm.
It's important to decide whether you're going to talk or you're going to listen. That's a really, really
Yeah.
basic thing that we take for granted because they do different things in a conversation. Talking puts in more information, is trying to influence. Listening is eliciting information from the other person, trying to understand.
Maybe add something. One of the reasons we really like to focus on talking or listening, which are you going to do or which are you doing, is that it doesn't take anything fancy. You don't have to learn new language.
Right.
You don't even have to go be very nuanced in how you're tracking what's going on if you're new to it. It's just, you want to talk or do you want to listen? What's your
Which
goal?
is going to be more useful at this particular moment in our conversation.
So people
Right.
listening to us right now can just, leave this interview and go out into their lives and maybe ask themselves a few times today, well, do I want to listen or do I want to talk right now? What's my purpose? And this is, like Dan said, for important conversations, really important. If you're just shooting the breeze, nothing special, talking about things that aren't important, you don't have to pay attention. You don't have to be conscious, so to speak.
Right. Yeah. As attuned or leaned in those
Exactly.
moments. Beautiful. So talking and listening, or maybe noticing if things are going sideways when you're talking, maybe switch. That comes to mind to me. Like maybe I'm doing too much of the talking in this moment.
Yeah.
Try listening and see how that goes for me
Well, that's the
here.
second
Great.
principle is creating some sort of balance, some sort of dynamic sense, kind of reciprocity of going back and forth. I mean,
Yeah.
sometimes one person does have a lot more to say and the other person's going to listen more. Generally, though, just asking yourself, how's the balance in the conversation between talking and listening?
Yeah. Love that.
And then the other one we covered already is pretty key is flooding versus chunking. Flooding is talking in pages uninterruptedly, and chunking is throwing in a pause and noticing how what you've said is affecting the other person. Both verbally, and they're signaling you either verbally or non-verbally.
Right. It seems so obvious when I hear you say it, Dan, but notice how what you've said is impacting the other person. I think what I notice sometimes in my own communication and when I'm working with clients around communication is that they're not looking for impact, they're looking for agreement.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They're
What's
not
the
looking
difference?
for what?
They're looking for agreement, not
Not,
not the impact, how they're affecting
impact.
someone.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, well, that is
Mhm.
that could be part of one's intention is, to see if the other person will agree with what you're
Yeah.
saying, and there might be something really important about that. However, if the other person is having a difficulty accepting what you're saying, it's going to be so, this is the case in any conflict or negotiation. It's really important to find out what's the obstacle, because I won't be able to get agreement all that easily if I don't understand what's getting in the way for the other person to accept what I'm saying.
Right.
And that's going to
Wow.
require listening, not more sending, not more talking.
Yeah.
And listening,
Yeah.
the way we present listening, if you agree, if the other person agrees or disagrees with you, it doesn't, oh no, if you agree or disagree with the other person, it doesn't really matter when you're listening, because when you're listening, you just want to understand what the person is saying. What you think in the moment when you're listening, your own opinions, whether you agree or disagree. It doesn't matter. It does matter. It does matter when you're done. Yes, yes, it does matter when you're done listening. Now it's your turn to talk about what's true for you. Then you are agreeing, disagreeing, whatever's coming up for you. But when you're listening, no, you don't need agreement or disagreement.
You're just trying to understand at that moment.
Just understanding.
Main focus is just understanding.
And that's pretty radical.
Yes, yeah, that is very radical. That's why I said Jedi level, because to be able to sit, there's a certain level of detachment in that moment of saying, I'm just here to hold space and to understand and to receive what you're sending, what you're communicating. I can filter it through my agree, disagree later, but my first level of listening is just understand. Do I get what you're trying to say here? Do I have that? And, would you agree that a lot of miscommunication and a lot of arguments start from the place of jumping so very quickly to I know what you're saying, and now let me refute it, before you really do that? And then now we're in the argument of like, yeah.
There's I don't know who said it, but there's a saying that one of the biggest assumptions about communication is that it's occurred, it's taken place. Because that is it's just such a big assumption that I understand you in the way you would like to be understood. I mean, I can understand you in the way that I think you should be understood, but that's my own type of understanding, which really might not be what you're trying to say.
Yeah. So that's where that reflective listening piece comes in. And something I know that I've run into with partners in my life, I will gender this a little bit. It's been the male partners in my life. When I start to try to even convey this idea of like, could you say back to me in your own words, like what you just heard? Oh, Nelly, maybe I'm not prompting them correctly, but I get so much. I don't need to do that. I understand what you're saying. There's like a resistance piece. And so it may just be, guys, when people have a lot of like, attitude, resistance, don't see the benefit in it, how do we navigate that?
So when you ask somebody, I've tried it myself in days gone by, of asking somebody to, tell me what you heard, kind of thing. Often people feel put on the spot, and it can be an unsuccessful invitation
yes
to what you want. So instead, I think it works much better to say what you're looking for. For example, I'm not sure if I was clear, if I really got that point across to you, and it would help me. It would help me if I could hear how I came across. Now it's more, you're on the spot. The other person doesn't feel as on the spot and more willing to give it a try.
In other words, telling them what your intention is, what you'd like.
Yeah.
I'd like to know that I was clear.
I'm clear.
Right.
Man, it's that old I language thing again, isn't it?
Exactly.
Oh, go ahead, Dan.
Yeah, well, it's just the desire to be understood, it's coming up.
Yeah.
And that's what you want to find out.
Yeah. It's a language that through the place of I.
Yeah. You don't want to put it out like it's a test, like you're testing the other person. Were you listening? No, but you're right. I think it's absolutely right. And if I'm honest with myself, I think in those moments I am doing a little bit of like, almost like gotcha, and so I can be real about that and say, oh yeah, that's where that can be a little bit of the heart of that kind of languaging. It's a little disingenuous. And so to instead put it on me of, I want to make sure I'm clear in how I've come across. That's amazing. And you're doing that not because that's the right thing to do, or you're a better person if you do it. You're doing it because you want something from the other person. And you want to influence that person in a certain way, to hear you in a certain way. And if you want to influence the other person, then don't put them on trial. Don't make them wrong.
Sounds right. Yeah, that sounds right.
You want to have a
Yeah,
kind of
you're not-
invitation for them.
Yeah, that's
So-
a serious roadblock to communication. Yeah, for
Right, yeah.
sure.
So you're more likely to get what you want if you do talk about what it is you do want.
Yeah, thank you. So a lot that goes on for people who've experienced sexual abuse is, they've obviously been traumatized. They've been with people and in environments that weren't safe. Their nervous system has been taught a whole lot of information about not safe. And there's this place in which, you talk about how communication skills play a part in a sense of safe. Could you flesh that out a little bit for us? What does that mean? How does that actually, um, how do those two things connect, safety and communication?
Mhm. Well, one thing is related to what we just talked about, which is as you focus on your communication and you start to notice what's going on in your communication with other people, one element you can focus on is what we call the positive intention, what it is you would like. And
Mhm.
people often state that in the negative. They talk about what they don't want, but that
Sure.
doesn't move things ahead. What tends to move things ahead is knowing and stating what you would like in an invitational way, if possible. So having clarity about that, I think helps people discover, first of all, what would be helpful for them in the moment, but also helps them locate what their priorities are. What it is that they're trying to create with another person, an environment of some sort, a sense of safety, a sense of trust. That
Yeah.
starts to be revealed as you become sensitive to your positive intentions.
I see. Love that. Beautiful. So I know one of my favorite things about the both of you is that you work on a lot of levels of understanding and knowledge, and you really speak about spirituality in the lens of communication and, that aspect of it. How is communication spiritual?
You should take that.
Okay. Then you first.
I'll take one. Let's say a tiny little bit.
Okay.
Yeah, and then you
Go
take
ahead.
the rest.
Go ahead.
I'll just throw in, I think for me, the communication is spiritual in the sense that it fosters compassion.
Mm,
And part of compassion is recognizing that we're all suffering on some level and to open our hearts to that with kindness to ourselves and others. And so talking and listening and using these skills, when you do use them, I think it can really show the way towards more compassion. So that's my answer. I don't know what Dan's answer is going to be.
okay.
That's pretty good. I'd go with that. I mean, one of the ways for me that the compassion element becomes more available is that in communication, there's so much emphasis you could have on just understanding, mutual understanding. And that's kind of a beginning element, is that the more I understand myself and someone else in conversations, the more I'm touched by the other person's experiences. The more I'm affected, the more I have some sense of empathy. And that's a strong element of communication, because it's not only the sense of being touched by their experience, it's the sense of recognizing how interdependent we all are with each other. We're mutually affecting each other in so many ways constantly throughout the day. And I think communication is sort of like the ocean in which we swim that is conveying that. So to focus on communication often heightens that sense of noticing the interdependence.
I love that so much. I'm really inspired by that. I think it's such a beautiful way in which to even think about a first intention of understanding and empathy, and maybe all the other stuff follows on from that influence and figuring things out, and all those pieces. But if we can start from the place of, let me just understand you and your experience in this moment, without it going and filtering through the lens of my ego and what that means about me and blah blah blah, like all that stuff, we'll be able to see each other more clearly. I have one more question for you all before we start to wrap up. So you've just had a shitty communication moment. Everything you're meant to do and that will be helpful. Nope, didn't follow any of the rules, didn't use any of the advice. There's been a rupture in the relationship, there's been hurtful words, there's a breakdown in communication. What's your favorite way for couples to come back, or people who are in partnership or friendships, whatever the context, for people to come back and repair?
I would say it starts with take a moment and breathe. I think just taking a moment and breathing.
Yeah.
And being able to look at where you are in that moment. What your positive intention is for the moment. And start finding your way back as you center yourself. If you can't regulate your emotions, you probably have to wait a little while.
Right.
Yeah.
I would agree with that. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Okay. Well, I just wanted to reflect that what I heard in that, Mudita, was that breakdowns in communication are often tied to a moment of dysregulation, to a moment of activation. And so you've stopped listening, you're not grounded, you're not present. And in order to be able to come back into a repair conversation, you're going to have to do a bit of that, kind of get some perspective, get yourself kind of grounded and notice where the activation was. Did I hear that right? Yeah.
Excellent.
And to recognize, I think just part of that is to recognize, if you're pretty dysregulated, that this isn't going to be all that productive time to keep talking, and you might just compound things by saying a lot of things that you'll later have to clean up because you were saying them from a place of being pretty off balance.
So taking a break, a break and saying when you'd like to come back and finish.
Yes.
Not just, I can't talk to you. I can't talk right now, and slam the door.
No. I
think I can get myself together in about 2 hours or minutes or whatever you need.
Yeah, I have to use that one a lot. Taking pauses for me is very important. Taking pauses and really helping my partners to understand, like, this is not an I don't love you moment. It's an I just need to take a space to get myself on straight before I can come back. I lied. I have one other question. So what I have found in my experience, and that I hear a lot of my clients struggle with, is when there's been an argument, that when we come back together, it's almost like this rehashing of the argument. Well, you said this, and then I said this. No, I didn't say that. I said this, or I meant that. It's like a replay. Yeah. And I would love your perspective about how beneficial that is. Is it helpful to try to do a blow by blow of, like, this was said, then this was said, I was responding to that? Or is there a way to, like, wash the slate clean and we just try to begin again? I'm so curious about your perspective about the benefit of that, or if there isn't any benefit.
Well, I mean, if you are repeating the same thing you just did, that could be, the same thing. I think it's really helpful to get a sense, we keep coming back to this in this conversation, of what your positive intention is. What is it you'd like to understand, or what is it you'd like to have understood? And what is it you'd like to accomplish in the conversation? And to have clarity about that coming into the conversation, and even to state it initially, so that you can use it as a pole star to give you guidance throughout the conversation. Well, is the direction we're going now related to this positive intention I had in the beginning? No, not really. This is going in a different direction. Okay, then how do I get back towards what I wanted to accomplish in this conversation? Having
Right.
clarity about that, I think, is so key for both people.
Yeah, sets a North Star. I love that.
And also the other thing is to be particularly mindful about talking and listening, and when to talk and when to listen, because if nobody is actually listening in the conversation, then it's hard to have a conversation.
Hard indeed, Dan.
Very hard.
Well, I have extremely enjoyed talking and listening with you all today. I adore you both so very much. I hold you in very high esteem. Everyone listening, please be sure to pop over to letstalkmethod.com. You can also find them on Instagram and Facebook with the same handle, Let's Talk Method. I will put the link in the show notes so that everyone can pop over and learn from you. If you're in the Bay Area, are you all still doing in-person workshops these
We're
days?
going to be moving to Zoom. We moved to Zoom during the pandemic, and partly
Yeah.
because of the way Zoom seems to connect without geographical limitations. I think we're going to
Mhm.
keep doing trainings on Zoom.
Fantastic. Okay, worldwide Beyond Survivors, you all can hook up with Dan and Mudita from wherever you are, your own living room. So get on their mailing list, follow them. And any just final words that you'd like to send out to our listeners today?
Well, thanks for having this conversation and opening up these possibilities, I think, for people to bring into their lives. I think, for me, the benefit of talking about communication and exploring together is we hopefully will understand each other better. And that starts the ball rolling for so many other things, developing that sense of mutual understanding. So I appreciate just being able to do this with you and to explore together this way.
Awesome.
Me
Dan,
too.
thanks for changing my life. Mudita, thanks for changing my life. Oh, go ahead, Mudita. Give me
No,
your
no,
final
that's
thought.
good. I'm happy to sit here
You're
with
happy
you
with
and
that? Well, truly, I just want to reiterate, Dan, being in those courses with you and sitting in conversation about coaching as an approach, like I really have you to credit for me being able to work in the capacity that I work with, people who've experienced sexual abuse. Thank you for your mentorship and your guidance. Mudita, your spunkiness, your playfulness, your joy is infectious. I'm always just inspired by what you have to share and how you show up in the world. And I look forward to staying in touch and reading your book more fully. And and I hope you all have just the rest of your day, blessed day. And thank you again. Mwah. Much love to you both. Thank you.
Thanks, Rachel.
thank you.
And thank you, everybody, for tuning in and joining us today. As always, you can pop over to rachelgrantcoaching.com to learn more about sexual abuse recovery coaching and explore the resources on the site. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast and then come back next time because we have so much more to share. And until then, take good care of you.